think we have survived the initial uh, technological hiccups. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tony Wakefield, I'm the chairman. Warm welcome to you all this evening. One slight bonus after the talk, the chairman will be issuing rum rations, so if you're playing around afterwards, you're more than welcome to do so. Tonight, in the further series in our talks, I'm very pleased to welcome Stephen Taylor, who is one of our own. Stephen is our information coordinator, and Stephen's role is looking after information for the benefit of the trustees, so that he keeps an eye on what TNA is up to across its various platforms and keeps the trustees informed whilst we're busy sorting out the affairs of the Friends. Stephen is a former journalist and also a former foreign correspondent, and is the author of 8 books. And his talk tonight is going to focus on the people who made history. It's not the famous admirals, it's all those people below decks and on decks, the ordinary seamen who made things happen. And we don't often hear about them in history. It's all about the famous people at the top, but it's those folks at the bottom who did all the hard work and the heavy lift that actually made things happen. So a warm welcome to Stephen. And Stephen, you are amongst friends, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, hello. I think I have been unmuted, and I can say good evening to you all, and thank you for turning on. One would normally have said turned up, but and I think perhaps we're all getting a little bit weary from Zooms and Teams and whatevers. So I do appreciate the fact that so many of you have turned on tonight. This aspect of technology actually has something of a relevance to the story that I'm about to tell, because although it seems perhaps hard to imagine now, Britain became a world power largely through a combination of wood, of canvas, of rope, and of the common seamen, who actually did the work with those things, as Tony has indicated. And they form, of course, the subject of my book, The Sons of the Waves. And we're talking about here the great age of sail from 1740 to 1840. I think we've generally been very good at celebrating our maritime past. You know, you go along to the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich, and there are these magnificent canvases of, epauletted, gold epauletted officers and magnificent ships of the line sailing along under full sail, locked in blazing battle. Next, first image, if I may ask, please. And there we have it, because also tucked away on the side of a wall at Greenwich is this portrait of one Tom Allen. Now, Tom started out his working life as a ploughman in Norfolk, and there he would almost certainly have remained for the rest of his life had he not come to the attention of another local young man, a man named Horatio Nelson, then entirely unknown, but still a Navy captain, and in desperate need of a seaman for his new ship. Now, what is interesting about this portrait to me is that it was obviously only painted because of Tom Allen's association with the great man. And indeed, generally speaking, the ordinary seaman is invisible in these images, and indeed in much of the history of the period. despite his vital role in all the great maritime endeavors that transformed Britain into a power. And I'm not just talking about battles here, because yes, naval supremacy was vital to establish that power at sea. But there were all the other aspects of seafaring which were contributing to the transformation of Britain. I'm talking about trade, discovery, charting, and navigation. And I think they're very often overlooked in the focus that we have on warfare. Cook's voyages to the South Seas, yes, those are well known, but there was also the East India Company and its voyaging to China, to India, which had such a vital role in transforming Britain into a mercantile power. And then, of course, we have the voyages that followed in the Age of Enlightenment, Darwin and the Beagle, for example, and all, of course, absolutely dependent on the common seaman. Now, the question may well be asked, why on earth did they go? I mean, the dangers of life at sea, as well as the hardships, were well enough known to discourage just about anybody from doing that. Dr. Johnson's view on this subject, well known, was no man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail, for being in a ship is being in a jail with the chance of being drowned. Perhaps that's the case, but seafaring was in fact booming at a time when agriculture was in decline. And the man who learnt the ropes as a seaman acquired a skill that was almost always in demand. Never more so then, when there were so many prolonged periods of Britain being at war, especially with France. The man who went to sea had a place to sleep. He was fed. He was paid, rather poorly, it must be said, but he was also provided with large quantities of drink. And we have this, perhaps unsurprisingly, a traditional image of Jack Tar. It's a bit of a combination. On the one hand, there's the enslaved victim of the press gang, and on the other, a sort of somewhat wild, drunken delinquent, and a man regarded therefore with a good deal of suspicion by his own countrymen. May I just check at this stage that I am being heard? I'm perhaps getting an impression that this line may be breaking up a bit.
No. I'm hearing you fine, Stephen.
Fine, very good. I'll just go ahead. So there was always, to me, there was always going to be a story to be told about these very colourful figures. But before I started to explore the subject, I probably had the impression, like many others, that it was going to be difficult to find anyone who'd actually told a story, because clearly, like so many other, the common folk at the time, it was assumed that they would have been illiterate. But as I soon started to find, however, there were a series of memoirs, diaries, journals in which at least a dozen very important instances of men telling their own stories from the lower deck, and another 12 or so secondary stories, diaries, which also contributed to the narrative. Could I have the next image, please? Yes, and here we have an example of one of the other crucial elements for charting these lives, of course, to be found in the treasure chest that we all so much, any of us who have done any research into historical subjects, contemporary subjects, the National Archives of Kew. And in my case, this involved the ADM records, the Admiralty records, which include ship's logs, crew lists, and records of court-martial hearings. Now, this is an example of a page from a ship's log. It's a form of daily diary of life at sea. They can be fairly prosaic things, you know, recordings of weather conditions, sea conditions, chart, position, and the like. But they're also a record of instances that were occurring daily on board ship, and that included battles, it included seamen's doings, it included obviously incidents when men were punished or affairs got out of hand. And we will come back to that theme. So who was Jack Tar? Well, his name proclaimed him as a man of the people, because Jack was a kind of generic name for the common man of the time. And yet actually, among his own class, he was always an outsider. At a time when those from the working groups of the population would never perhaps move from their native valleys, Jack was, of course, wandering the world and discovering all the exotic mysteries and differences that there were to be found across there. Could I have the next image, please? Now, this is I think it's a wonderful image. This is a painting of Tahiti in 1776 by William Hodges, who accompanied Cook on his second voyage to the South Seas. And as we can see there, it gives an indication of the naked island women, hints at this kind of, well, idyllic world that people who ventured to Polynesia in those early years of seafaring were discovering. And we can perhaps imagine how those seamen who had been on a voyage like this came home bearing these fabulous stories of what they have seen, strangeness of the creatures that are living on the other side, different peoples, their languages, and how it is that they never quite fit in again with the hinterlands that they came from. And perhaps also we get an idea of why they got a reputation for telling these very tall stories. I think there's another feature about Jack as I see it, and that is what set him apart from most other working people, and that it was his sense of pride. It evolved from his work, from the need that the nation had for seamen. And there's a very interesting note made by a Navy surgeon who take years to observe the men who were actually serving on the ships that he served on, and men who were in his care. And he described them thus. He said, "Their mind, by custom and example, is trained to brave the fury of the elements with a degree of contempt for danger and death that is to be met with nowhere else. Excluded by the employment they have chosen from all other society, the deficiencies of education are not felt, and information on general affairs is not courted. Their pride consists in being reputed a thoroughbred seaman, and they look on all landsmen as beings of inferior order." This idea of pride is a recurrent theme, and I think it's partly down to the need that they fulfill in Navy and other ships. It's also down to the nature of their duty, because an able hand had to be agile, strong, youthful enough to climb to the top and there to stand 100 feet above a plunging deck, to brace himself against the yards, the beams across the mast, his feet held onto the ropes below, and all the time swaying through something like 60 degrees as the ship moved along. And in the process, I think, I have very limited experience of it myself, but getting a vision of the element, of the world at its most powerful, and most elemental, and feeling the awe and sense of exhilaration that that brought. Could I have the next image, please? This is one of the very few contemporary images that we have of a seaman at his labours. We don't have many, and none of the men are actually in the tops, probably for the quite simple reason that artists had no great desire to go up there in order to paint them at their work. And I think we do well to remember, looking at men like this, and the fact that he's not in a uniform, that seamen in the age of sail were not part of a standing force. They didn't join the navy. They joined a ship, and that gave them an independence most unusual for men of their standing at that particular time. Because if a man didn't like his ship, didn't like his captain, didn't like his lieutenant, he could desert at the next port and very easily find another ship which would take him on, because his skills were always in need. Now, that wasn't a straightforward matter. Desertion was a capital crime, but remarkably, it seems very rarely, if one studies the ship's logs and the incidences of desertion, it very often is evident that it didn't restrain a man once he had decided that that was what he wanted to do. And I think this freedom, and it is a paradoxical kind of freedom because there's always the press gang background, contributed to the sense of brotherhood that one hears speaking from the seaman's own voice. They were a tribe. They were kept on a very confined space. There was a lot of hardship. There was a lot of suffering. There was very often death. But they also shared this common endeavor. They shared victory. And every now and again, they had the windfall of a prize money when it came their way on taking an enemy ship. The critical period, I think it's fair to say, from the balance of this narrative is the wars with France between 1793 and 1815. And this is where impressment becomes a theme, because you have these images of the press gang, very prevalent at the time. Usually a band of thugs with their cudgels seizing some forlorn figure from the bosom of his family. The reality could actually be a good deal more painful, because you have a number of instances of men coming home after a year, possibly more, away from family, from their home, and coming in sight of home shore only to be seized by a press gang, transferred to another ship and sent off to another quarter of the world without any connection with their families and relatives at all. But impressment wasn't the only means of recruitment. I mentioned Tom Allen earlier on. Now, Nelson was among a group of captains. They're interesting to note that these were some amongst the most successful captains who used their own neighbor, their own home communities as a recruiting source for seamen. Others who did it, Cuthbert Collingwood was one, Edward Pellew was another. And I think this created an additional bond, kind of, because they came from the same vicinity, the same heartland, there was a kind of common purpose and a common vision. And in the case of Tom Allen and Nelson, this led to the most remarkably informal relationship between the two men, because there were known to be instances where Nelson was perhaps at the table with the invited guests in the great cabin and he did like a glass of wine, didn't he? When Tom Allen would come in and tell him that he'd had rather too much to drink, And there were even occasions when he would lift his somewhat tired and emotional admiral from his seat and usher him back to his cabin. So we get this image of mutual dependence. Happy ships were a place where men and the officers who ordered them recognized that they had a mutual dependence upon one another. Not all ships were happy, and of course we will get to that in due course. Next image, please. Yes. Now, I have two particular seamen who provided a kind of a thread that I followed, and their names were Jack Nicol and Jacob Nagel, and they were almost paradoxical characters, the sort of formula of Jack Tar, who he was. This is John Nicol, and he was a kind of a thoughtful romantic. He was actually taken to sea by reading Robinson Crusoe, which is a somewhat curious thing in itself, you might think. You know, who would want to go to sea and become a castaway on a desert island? But perhaps there was something about that narrative which gave an indication to those who read it of the world that existed beyond. And it crops up remarkably often in the words of seamen as something that they'd had taken an interest in. In the case of Nicol, he spent, well, decades on naval and merchant ships. He was in the guns at the Battle of the Nile, but he was also something of a natural adventurer. He always wanted to visit those exotic parts of the world, which he did in the case of China and the South Seas. And he writes remarkably, well, with huge enthusiasm and excitement about his experiences and quite interesting observations about the cultures that he found there. But he was also, and this is something perhaps unusually unexpected among seamen, he was remarkably unworldly in the ways of men outside his own world. He was on the Lady Juliana. Now, the Lady Juliana was one of a group of convict ships in a group known as the Second Fleet, transporting convicts to New South Wales. And in the case of the Lady Juliana, she was transporting female convicts. And that ship became notorious for the escapades that went on between the women convicts and the seamen themselves. Nicol, for his part, fell hopelessly in love with one of the women convicts. And it's perhaps an interesting, just a bit of information about the length that these voyages took to say that their child was actually born on board ship before the Lady Juliana arrived in New South Wales. And on parting, Nicol had a desire to return and to find Sarah Whitlam. He embarked on this quest, hopeless in the end, but he did find out what had become of her. And that's another story, for which there's not quite enough time, unfortunately. But I do like his reflections on what was regarded as the wildness of seamen's behavior once they'd been paid off. And he wrote, "Did those on shore experience half the sensations of a sailor at perfect liberty after being years on board ship without a will of his own, they would not blame his eccentricities, but wonder that he was not more foolish." Now, the other side of Jack's character, as I see it, is represented by a fellow named Jacob Nagel. Unfortunately, we don't have an image of him. But Nagel cut an altogether more dashing figure. He was actually an American who fought on land for America's independence, and then quite happily joined the Royal Navy and spent most of his life sailing happily in British ships. He survived battle, shipwreck, and being cast away. And Nagel is kind of foremast Jack writ large. You know, he's the most extraordinary character. rambunctious amongst his fellows, very quick with his fists when there's what he sees as a need for it, stands up to authority when he feels it's necessary. Loves going ashore with his shipmates for a carouse, and yet when it comes to women, is very thoughtful and generous, perceiving the difficulties that these are very often, almost invariably, commercial relationships once men come ashore at places like Portsmouth. He's very empathetic to what women need to do to suffer and to survive in their own way. In the case of Nagel in particular, I think there's something very interesting about his memoirs, about just how, because of the extent of his adventures, you can read it and after a while and just find yourself questioning whether all this can be actually true. Sometimes it just sounds like an old hand spinning yet another fabulous yarn, but perhaps making the whole thing up. Well, then we go to, if we could please, the next image. If, however, we go back to these Admiralty records and we study the records of the ships that Nagel, among the other subjects I write on, served in, and we see here, for example, this is a ship's muster. Now, this gives the details of all the seamen who served on this particular ship, when they joined, their rating, and when they were paid off, and other details of their service. And if we go back to those records in Nagel's case, invariably, there he is to be found, time and time again, exactly the same circumstances that he describes in his memoirs. And if we go to the ship's logs, there we find him too, even in cases where he's getting the lash. And in each case, the events that he describes in significant details are there compressed to the daily record of the ship's diary, the ship's log. I would take one more, a particularly interesting case in point. When a seaman named James Choice died in a Brighton lodging house in 1836, it was found that he'd kept a journal. It had never been published. And although it's written in sort of rather wooden style, it tells the most fabulously extraordinary story about how, when Choice first went to sea as a little more than a boy on a whaling ship, he'd been taken prisoner off Peru and then spent years surviving at the very edge in various parts of South America. How he made escape attempts, eventually succeeded, had a brief career as a pirate, and then another spell in captivity, this time in France. And at this point, he writes in his journal, "I disowned the name of an Englishman, as it had always been unlucky to me. And I joined the enemy, reasoning, who would not fight for so good a master as Bonaparte?" Well, that's quite an interesting admission in itself. An English seaman admitting that he had, quite matter-of-factly, that he decided to become a traitor. Then he goes on in his journal, and of course, France doesn't suit him either in the end, so he decides to move on. And he writes of how, on sighting a British squadron at anchor off Brittany, he and another Englishman, also in the same situation, named Watts, stole a boat, and they rowed out to a ship which happened to be the Theseus. And at this point, you're inclined to say, come on again, this has just got to be a whopper. Well, could I ask for the next image, please? Well, if we there look, and it's not easy to make it out, but you can see there that on the June the 29th of 1808, two seamen, James Choice and Gilbert Watts, had joined the ship, coming up the side, and just up there you will see "Off Lorient from French prison." And there you have, in that snapshot, the seaman's yarn again, kind of so wildly improbable and yet confirmed once more. The traitor being welcomed back on board a British ship, straight back into King's service, straight back into getting his pay, getting his food, getting his rum, and illustrating for me once more the mobility of the seamen. Now, this has been perhaps a little bit presenting what you might call an upbeat view of the seaman world. There's no getting away from the fact that there were very often a very dark side to it as well. The press gang I have mentioned, although I think I would just say about the press gang, one of the sort of common images that we have that ordinary civilians were being seized off the streets and sent off onto Navy ships. That tends to be something of an exaggeration. It did happen, but not in any sort of significant numbers at all, simply because captains didn't want anybody on their ships who had took up space below and who weren't being able to do the job that they were needed for. So as well as impressment, then we have the small issue of the lash. Could I have the next image, please? Yes. Now, flogging, of course, was a routine, and the results were absolutely gruesome. This is a well-known caricature. It's accurate enough in its own way, but it hardly gives a full picture of what was involved. That was described by a seaman named Samuel Leach, who wrote that the human flesh treated by a cat of nine tails resembled roasted meat burnt nearly black before a scorching fire. Now, the maximum number of lashes permitted by Navy regulations was 12, but in such matters, everything was dependent upon the all-powerful figure on a ship, and that is, of course, the captain. And that takes us back to the records at Kew. If I could have the next image, please. Yes. Now, yes, this, of course, again, is as we see it, the daily diary of events at sea. And this is an example of the log of the frigate Nagel when she was cruising in the Indian Ocean in 1808. There's nothing very remarkable there. There's an incident on October the 9th, as a result of which one man, Robert Allen, gets 26 lashes for mutinous expression. Can't see this in detail, but that's what it says. 3 others get 12 for disobedience, and one gets 24 for theft. The next day, the man named William Canham fell overboard and was drowned. But there's a deeper and very much darker story to the Nereid, because over 2 weeks in that ship, at about the same time, the captain of the ship, Robert Corbett, ordered 26 men to receive a total of 924 lashes. That's in the space of 2 weeks, 14 days. 924 lashes. It was 36 to an average of each man, but one was given 60 and another got 72. The Nereid, this little diary we have in front of us here, was actually that very rare but very terrible thing in what constituted naval service a true hell afloat. I wish there was time to go more into her story because it's an extraordinary, powerful one as well. But pare it down. Corbett's brutality led to what was described as a mutiny. In fact, what this involved was the crew demanding that they be allowed to take the ship to a port to have their grievances against Corbett heard by a senior group of officers. The next image, please. The upshot of this so-called mutiny was that 5 men were sentenced to death, although after what the log calls due deliberation of several circumstances, and I don't know, yes, we do have that, due deliberation of several circumstances. 4 of them were pardoned. 1 man was hanged. Now, the due deliberation of several circumstances clearly was a reference to an understanding that Corbett was a brute, no less. He was subsequently subjected to a court-martial hearing himself, and for his conduct, it was recorded in the log that Captain Corbett was reprimanded. Excuse me. Mutiny in general is a big theme in seafaring history. Of course, we've heard about the Bounty, I think, probably quite enough times. But I find it surprising that more attention has not been paid to what is often referred to as the Great Mutinies. And why I find this surprising is that it seems to me that these events were they set a landmark in the wider context of social history of the time. This was the common man, in effect, rising up. Because what happened was that in 1797, the war was finally poised. The French were anchored at Brest with an army ready to launch an invasion. And at the same time, seamen were getting thoroughly angry, and they were finding their voice. Pay at that stage had not been increased for almost 150 years. They were on the same wages as they had been in 1645. Inflation was meanwhile soaring, and families were suffering ashore. So on Easter Sunday, the crews of the entire Channel Fleet at Spithead refused orders to go to sea. Now, that is to say that something like 30,000 men on 80 ships staged a mass mutiny. Their demands were quite simple. They wanted improved wages for all men and improved rations. And until these were approved and a pardon from the king was granted to every man, no anchor would be raised on any ship unless the French set out from Brest, in which case they would sail to give battle directly. This mutiny was led by a remarkably young man. He was 26, but his name was Valentine Joyce, and he had been at sea since the age of 11. So he was acknowledged by his fellows as a respected, thorough seaman, one who could speak their cause, which he did in a way that won the respect even of those from the Admiralty, senior members of another class, who were gathered around the table in negotiations with him. The whole thing was conducted with order and great restraint on the part of the supposed mutineers. And it ended quite peacefully with the seamen's demands being met. Nelson's opinion of this was that for a mutiny, he said, it has been the most manly that I ever heard of, and it does the British sailor infinite honor. It didn't quite end there. Soon afterwards, a second mutiny broke out at the Nore, which is a small anchorage on the east coast of the country, in pursuit of further reforms. But this time there were elements of a radical involvement. There'd been talk, obviously, engendered by the revolution across the Channel. And there was a revolutionary element involved in the Nore mutiny. And at various points it became disorderly. There was no solid thread of command, and the end of it was chaotic and painful. Once again, though, these records at Kew give us a remarkable insight and dramatic reading they make, I must say, a remarkable insight into those events. In all, 30 men were hanged for that uprising, including the nominal leader, Richard Parker. I say nominal because I don't think really he was in charge. And the leading figures, the agitators behind it, managed to escape to France, where they took up service on French ships. But almost immediately, redemption for the seamen came in the form of battle. Almost within a matter of weeks, there follows the Battle of Camperdown, relatively overlooked, but a very significant battle in its own right. And then, of course, the turning points of the war itself, battles of the Nile and Trafalgar. And at this point, there appears to have been a kind of epiphany among the ruling class, a recognition that between the mutinies on the one hand and the battles on the other, that this much derided figure was in fact a man who held Britain's destiny in his calloused hands. It's as simple as that. Their tributes start to flow from senior officers, but I would just refer to one, which comes in fact from a French captain who had been at Trafalgar and had surrendered his ship, which was therefore being sailed by British seamen when the great storm that came on after the battle, when it descended on the ship. And he wrote how the British seamen immediately set to work to shorten sail and reef in topsails with as much regularity and order as if their ships had not been fighting a dreadful battle. We were all amazement, wondering what the English sailor could be made of. All our seamen were drunk or disabled. Another image, please. At the end of the day, at least for those with families, there was a homecoming. And in most cases, of course, it was entirely unexpected and unannounced. Technology, again, has a part here. There are no letters to say, I've arrived back and I will be with you in a matter of weeks. They simply arrive. What Jane Austen called the true sailor way. One seaman named Ned Coxery, who came home to his wife for the first time in years, he wrote of this: "She, being surprised, could hardly speak, for she knew not before whether I was dead or alive. I laid down my pack and rested myself, and had my relations come about me with joy." And I think that painting could almost have been conjured from Coxery's words. The brotherhood endured really until the coming of steam. And at that stage, with the need for smaller, more technically qualified crews and the creation of a standing Navy force, men in uniform and the like, Jack Tar, in my story, came ashore for the last time. One of those who was actually there as part of that age and who sailed in British ships for the early part of his life, before he went on to become one of the great writers in the English language, was a Pole named Joseph Conrad. And Conrad wrote in one of his diaries of seafaring life how his own character had actually been shaped by his shipmates. And he wrote this: "These were men who knew toil, privation, violence, debauchery, but they knew not fear. They had no spite in their hearts. They were men hard to manage, but easy to inspire. Voiceless men, but men enough to scorn in their hearts the sentimental voices that bewailed the hardness of their fate. It was a fate unique to their own. The capacity to bear it appeared to them the privilege of the chosen. They were the everlasting children of the mysterious sea." And thank you. That's all I have to say about that subject, but I'm very happy to take any questions that anybody might like to ask.
Stephen, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. If anybody would like to ask some questions whilst I start a conversation with Stephen, can you use the chat line, and then we can pick up the questions as they come in, and if we got some similar questions, then we can roll them together. Stephen, I think I'm going to start from an archival point of view, because I never cease to be amazed what's in the building behind me. But the tales that you tell are from records that have been halfway around the world and back and survived. So it'd be interesting to know just to what extent that record does exist. Obviously, there's been some losses, but it seems quite remarkable.
It truly is remarkable that in my exploration of the logs and the cruise musters, these were the sort of, if you like, the sort of essential standing points on which I could base my knowledge of the records that I would, of the books, the diaries that I was reading. In almost every case, they had survived. Mm. Now, clearly, there are instances where records have been lost, but if we consider the period that we're actually talking about, and I'm actually going back to the Anson voyage in 1740, these are records which somehow, and they are wonderfully voluminous, which have survived in remarkable condition and can chart that entire history almost without a gap. There are spaces indeed, but I didn't find anything that I really needed to discover that I found was missing.
It is.
So we're absolutely blessed in that respect. Anybody interested in maritime history, I don't know if it's because the Admiralty was so clerical minded that they kept these things so comprehensively and so well, but they certainly have survived in that way.
Yeah. So would a ship's log last just for one voyage and then they'd start a new log?
It would depend. No, they tend to be done by period. And they would be, you would be sort of, I mean, sometimes you would simply have, because of the number of pages that had been involved, the captain would be signing the log off for that period. Perhaps it was, well, I think you might say, I would estimate on memory, between 2 and 3 months at a time, because we obviously have a full page would be covering 2 days, morning, evening, morning, evening.
Yeah.
And a period of between 2 and 3 months at a time, I think would be fairly standard.
Mm. We've got some questions rolling in. We've got one from Brian. How long was normal active service for Jack Tar?
As long as he was fit enough or sober enough to continue with it. Really, there's no simple answer to that question. I mean, a great number of men, of course, simply fell by the wayside, discarded, and would disappear completely. John Nicol, who I referred to earlier on, ended up begging on the streets where he was found. He was the the seaman whose picture we used as an illustration.
Yeah.
There are other instances where the fortunate men who had served and survived had that institution to go to, which was, of course, the hospital was called the Hospital at Greenwich, which was in fact a pensioner's home, and an extraordinarily wonderful palace it was for anybody who'd been serving years at sea to end up in this magnificent. I don't know if anybody's actually seen it recently. It's been undergoing a refurbishment, but the hospital, as it was called, at Greenwich, was in fact the pensioner's home. I'm afraid I can't. There's no simple answer to the longevity of the seaman's life.
No, sure. So the hospital at Greenwich, was it open to all ranks?
It was all ranks.
All ranks.
It was specifically for those in need, and there was a process by which you would be approved for entry. You would present yourself at a kind of a gallery with a gallery of others with records of your service. If you couldn't produce your record of service, there was a very little chance that you were going to be able to find a place.
Yeah.
But you would present your service with a kind of form of reference from your captain of old. And from there on in, once you were inside the door, it was a fine place to end those days. And in fact, Tom Allen, who I mentioned at the very beginning, Nelson's servant, became something of a celebrity at the hospital in Greenwich. People would come by and ask to meet the man who served with Nelson. Very happy to give him a chat and have his glass topped up at the same time.
Yes. Yes. I see from Carol Ann, we've got a question. How many ships and seamen on each ship were there, say, 1815, for example? I guess it very much depends on what type of vessel it was.
If we're talking about numbers, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, if absolutely, a frigate would have a crew of about 150. That included 150, including sort of, that would include the petty officers as well as the common seamen. And the common seamen themselves came in a hierarchy. There was the able seaman at the top, there was the ordinary seaman next, and there were kind of those at the bottom called landsmen. Yes, around 150 for a frigate, and for a large ship of the line, I should remind myself, I think I've got a note here. Yes, a 74-gun ship would have a crew of more than 700, ideally. Wow. Of course, and these were sort of figures which were floating about. Sometimes there weren't simply that number of men available to crew that ship, but ideally speaking, that was the number that she was ought to have been allocated. Yeah.
I see further down the chat line that Elizabeth has flagged up one of TNA's experts, Bruno Pappalardo, who gives figures of 713 ships in service in 1814, which had around 145,000 men serving on them. So it's a sizable force.
It certainly was. At the same time, because there was no standing force, this was another aspect of the seaman service which sometimes was overlooked. When there was the brief peace in the two wars with France, after the first end of the first phase of the war, virtually all of the ships were demobilized, leaving out of a force of more than well over 100,000, I think about 120,000 at that stage of the war. They were reduced to about 18,000. And then when the war resumed again, these same men were being plundered because they'd gone off to rather better paid service in the East India Company or other merchant ship, because they did pay better than the Navy. And this is where the press gang came again into a ruthless operation.
Yeah. We have a question from Alan about specific regulations for men facing capital punishment when at sea.
Oof, it was a lot. It was a lot. I mean, off the top of my head, I can't spell out all of them. But capital punishment was, well, I mean, protest, desertion. I mean, act of being caught as a deserter made you liable to be hanged. In practice, it wasn't used in cases like that, simply because if a man was a useful hand, he got his job back. He was better off back on the lower deck than he was strung up on the yardarm. But the number of offences, the nominal offences for which a man could be hanged, was very extensive. Off the top of my head, I could say I couldn't give a complete list at the moment.
And are there many instances of captains and senior officers being condemned for their cruelty?
Very rare. And the fact that, the fact that a man like Corbett escaped with a reprimand is an indication of that. I mean, the officer class itself is fascinating. I think we have this idea, these men must have been sadists if they behaved like this. I think there was something else about it. There was a kind of isolation and a sort of a zealous lunacy, madness took over in cases like this. Corbett was brutal, but he was always motivated by duty. He died actually in battle with there's a whole series of folk tales that evolved around his death. It was suggested at one stage that he was so hated that he'd actually been murdered by his own men. In fact, I've examined that particular one, and it's not the case. But I think it was more a case of the unpopular man, the unpopular officer lost his hands. They would simply desert in numbers whenever they could. And so it was a kind of a cautionary tale, if you like, against that kind of behavior. It didn't always work, but a happy ship was a successful ship.
Yes.
And the successful captain was a man who learned his way and how to handle those matters of discipline and communality on board his own vessel.
Yes. Yes. Okay, I'm just scanning down the list of questions. Where have we got to? Julie, do we know how many deaths there were as a result of capital punishment or from subsequent infection?
Well, you mean over the 100 period, over the period of the 100 years of the? I couldn't give a figure for that. No. I mean, it was so much a whimsical thing that men might be sentenced to death, as in the case not only of those on the Nereid, which I mentioned earlier, but also after the Great Mutiny at the Nore. Now, 30 were hanged, but the number who were sentenced to death was at least twice that. And there was a recognition in a lot of these cases that execution needs to be exemplary. You make, if you like, a martyr of a few men, and that serves a lesson to the majority. I couldn't give a figure for the precise number. It was certainly common, but then of course it was a hanging was a very common business in the society of the 18th and 19th centuries, which is what gave rise to the convict voyages to New South Wales. We decided to exile people rather than continue to hang them.
Okay, just looking down the list again. Was promotion or medals for bravery awarded outside battle station in time of war?
Well, there were no medals. There were no medals for the common seaman this time. Did he get promotion? He could get promotion. It all depended very much on what he aspired to. There are very few instances of men rising from the very low ranks to officer level and above. They do exist. One, I think, the most notable example to my knowledge, was Edward Pellew, who went all the way from common seaman up to nobility and admiralty rank. But he was a very rare instance, and largely made because of his success as a fighting captain. Yes, it was a kind of, there were cases where promotion was on offer, but it generally led to petty officer rank, quartermaster, thereabouts, rather than real command. Pellew was the most unusual case.
Yeah. How many lashes would an average man survive?
Well, good question. I mean, I mentioned a man who got 72 on the Nereid.
Yes.
He did survive.
Yeah.
It all came down, though, in the end, to the strength of a man's constitution. There are instances of men dying after, it was the other punishment of being flogged around the fleet, where a man was put in a boat, taken from ship to ship, where he got lashed, X number of lashes on each of those ships, depending on the number of ships that there were, and that did lead to death, infection and death.
Yeah, sounds quite barbaric, doesn't it?
That was. I mean, that was totally, totally brutal punishment. Flogging around the fleet was an atrocity.
It must have been for something extremely serious, though, surely.
Well, yes, but again, notionally, these things can always vary. They're always variable, and it always depends on the those in charge of the court-martial hearing at the particular time, and perhaps the need of the court-martial authorities to sustain if you like, the position of the captain who's rendered a complaint. Officers standing up against other officers was not a particularly well-charted field, I don't think.
No. See, Elizabeth has helpfully put up the court martials, the Navy Record Society court martials from 1793 to 1815. So that's obviously a very useful resource.
Yes, hugely.
Yeah. And of course, alongside infection that we've been talking about as a result of punishment, you've also got disease on board ship as well.
And
it's taken a huge toll.
And disease and accidents, disease first, accident second, took off far, far, far more men than battle.
Yeah.
And one of the most deadly campaigns fought by the Navy was the attempt to suppress the slave trade off West Africa, the setting up of what was called the Preventative Squadron in 1815. We had Act of Abolition in 1807. From 1815, there was a regular force established off West Africa to curtail the trade. But the diseases coming off the shore, and particularly in places like Sierra Leone, were so widespread that the casualty rates were amongst the highest in naval history. And those crews, those men, had to be supplemented. Unfortunately, they were supplemented by African seamen who had a tradition on that part of the coast, of a seafaring tradition of their own. They were known as crewmen, and they make a very interesting subject themselves.
Yeah. Okay, and I think the last question then, Stephen, is around 1815, was the British Navy the biggest in the world?
Sorry, I missed that. Was
the last question in the chat? Was the British Navy the biggest in the world in 1815?
1850 or 1815?
15.
15. Oh yes. I mean, I can't give you ship's numbers, but well, I think Bruno Pappalardo's.
Yes, we've got that further back.
That, but yes, the number of hands mustered at the end of the war in 1815 was almost 150,000.
Yeah.
And as a force, that was the highest that the Navy had ever reached at that point.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, once that period was over, once the war and the need of the Navy for men of those qualifications, once that had ceased, that made a lot of seamen jobless and without employment, and led to a lot of hardship.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Stephen, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk, and I've certainly learnt a lot, and it's really realised just how much wealth of material that we've got that's still to be explored. But for tonight's talk, you've done us proud, and I'm very grateful. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, no, and thank you all. Thank you all for turning up.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Maggie, we've got the next slide, please, just to give you an update of what's coming next. So we've got two talks scheduled at the moment. We've got one for the 1st of June and one for the 30th. If you haven't already done so, there's a recent email with Eventbrite links and a direct link to Zoom itself as well. So if you'd like to join us on either of those or both dates, we'd be very pleased to see you. So thank you very much to everyone for coming along this evening. And another thank you for Stephen. It was brilliant. We thoroughly enjoyed it. My best advice in these strange times is something that was very valuable 80 years ago. Keep calm and carry on. Thank you very much. Good night.